Once upon a time, there was a young girl named Nedi. She was kind and loving, living in her father's grand mansion alongside her aunt and cousin. Her father, Chief Ofor, was an exceptionally wealthy businessman who was rarely present to care for his daughter. His extensive travels for business meant he had to entrust Nedi's upbringing to his sister, believing she would love and nurture her as her own. However, what Chief Ofor did not realize was that his sister harbored no affection for Nedi. She had never liked Nedi's late mother and carried that resentment forward, directing it at the innocent girl. Every time she looked at Nedi, she was reminded of the woman she once despised, the woman who had married her brother and, in her eyes, taken him away from his family. Chakotay, the aunt, loathed Nedi with every fiber of her being and never missed an opportunity to show it. To her, Nedi was an unwelcome reflection of her mother, bearing a striking resemblance in both appearance and demeanor. The bitterness ran deep. Years ago, Chakotay had tried to persuade her brother to marry a friend of hers, but he had refused, choosing instead to wed Bui, Nedi's mother, whom Chakotay deemed unworthy of a man like him. This rejection bred resentment, a grudge that only deepened when Bui passed away a few years after Nedi's birth. Chief Ofor, preoccupied with his work, invited his sister to his home, trusting her to care for his daughter and manage his household. What he failed to see was the animosity that Chakotay harbored. One day, Chief Ofor embarked on another business trip, leaving behind a substantial sum of money for Chakotay to ensure Nedi's well-being. He departed, believing his daughter was in safe hands. Little did he know this would prove to be the gravest mistake of his life. The moment he was gone, Chakotay's demeanor changed entirely. The affectionate and dutiful sister that Chief Ofor had placed his trust in transformed into someone cold and merciless. The moment Chief Ofor's car disappeared from sight, Chakotay turned to Nedi with a look of pure malice. "Now, little devil," she sneered, "since your father is gone, let's see how much of a princess you really are." That day marked the beginning of Nedi's suffering. Chakotay wasted no time in stripping away all her privileges. She took away her fine clothes and jewelry, replacing them with worn-out rags. She gave Nedi's luxurious room to her own daughter, while forcing Nedi to sleep in the cold, dark kitchen. "You don't deserve to live like a princess," Chakotay spat, calling Nedi a burden. At first, Nedi thought the cruelty would pass, but as the days turned into weeks, it only grew worse. Chakotay turned her into a servant in her own father's house. Every morning, long before sunrise, Nedi was forced to wake up and clean the entire house, wash clothes, and cook meals she was never allowed to eat. She watched helplessly, as her aunt and cousin devoured the food she had prepared while she remained hungry. As the months went by, Chakotay and her daughter found new ways to torment Nedi. They worked her to exhaustion, denied her food, and treated her worse than a common servant. If she dared to rest for even a moment, Chakotay's cane would lash against her back. "Family. You should be grateful we even let you stay here," Chakotay would sneer, her eyes filled with spite. Her cousin Ego, who had grown up spoiled and entitled, took pleasure in Nedi's suffering. She would deliberately spill palm oil on the floor, forcing Nedi to scrub the stain over and over again. Sometimes she would step on Nedi's fingers while she was scrubbing, laughing cruelly as Nedi winced in pain. "Look at you," Ego mocked one evening as she sat on the couch peeling an orange. "You used to be the princess of this house, but now you're nothing but a worthless servant." Nedi stood there, broken, as she watched Ego belittle her in her own father's home. She knew better than to argue with someone who would stop at nothing to see her suffer. A year passed, then another, and still Chief Ofor had not returned. Nedi couldn't help but worry. Her father had never been away for this long without sending word. Rumors began to spread. Some claimed he had been ambushed and killed by thieves, while others whispered that he had abandoned his daughter to start a new life with another wife. Ego encouraged these rumors, relishing the despair on Nedi's face whenever she spoke ill of her father. "Face the truth, girl," Ego taunted one evening as Nedi gazed out of the window, tears welling in her eyes. "Your father is gone. He couldn't wait to run far away from you before you drained him dry, you leech." Nedi bit her lip, fighting back, tears. She refused to believe Ego's words, but deep down, doubt began to creep in. Had her father truly abandoned her? Was the love he had promised her nothing but empty words? Later that night, as Nedi was about to sleep, Ego stormed into the kitchen. "Go to the pharmacy and get me some pain medicine," she ordered. Nedi glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. "I can't go out at this time," she protested. Ego's response was swift and brutal. A sharp slap across Nedi's face. "How dare! You question me, you daughter of a nobody?" Ego hissed. "You have no one to save you, so you'd better do as I say." Nedi held her burning cheek, her heart pounding with anger. She knew that if she resisted further, her Aunt Chakotay would get involved, and the punishment would be far worse. Without another word, she nodded and turned toward the door. The streets were dark and eerily silent. Nedi walked briskly, heading toward the only pharmacy she knew might still be open. Her feet ached and her stomach twisted with hunger, but she pushed forward, whispering a quiet prayer. "Please, God, protect my father. Bring him back to me," she murmured, as she continued. Down the deserted street, Nedi suddenly stumbled upon an old woman who appeared to be badly injured. Instinctively, she stopped, unable to ignore the sight before her. She took a cautious step forward, her heart pounding. Nedi knelt beside the old woman, concern filling her eyes. "Are you all right?" she asked, gently. The woman's eyelids fluttered. "Open!" and her voice trembled with pain. "Help me, child, I can barely move," she whispered. "Hold on. I'll get you some medicine," Nedi assured her before dashing toward the pharmacy. With trembling hands, she quickly purchased the medication Ego had requested. As she counted the little change left, she decided to use it to buy medicine for the old woman as well. But when she returned, the woman was gone. Nedi froze, scanning the area. There was no trace of her. Had she imagined it? Doubt crept into her mind as she questioned whether what she had seen was real. Shaking off the confusion, she rushed back home, only to find Ego pacing back and forth, her mother, Chakotay, standing beside her with a deep scowl. "Where do you think—" "You're coming from at this hour?" Chakotay demanded. Nedi opened her mouth to explain. "Auntie, Ego sent me to buy—" "Liar!" Ego interrupted sharply, her eyes burning with accusation. "She snuck out to meet a man!" Before Nedi could defend herself, Chakotay charged forward, raising her hand to deliver a harsh slap. But before she could strike, something strange happened. Nedi watched in shock as her aunt's hand suddenly turned against her. Smack! Chakotay's eyes widened in horror as her own palm struck her face. Then it happened again, and again. "What? What is happening to me?" she gasped, struggling to stop herself, but her hand continued to slap her mercilessly. Ego stumbled back in fear. "Mama, stop it! You're scaring me!" she cried as she watched her mother's face turn red from the relentless blows. Nedi stood frozen, her mind racing. She had endured years of cruelty, but never had she imagined witnessing something so unexplainable. Chakotay dropped to her knees, her breath ragged as she pleaded desperately, "Nedi, please, save me." Nedi remained still, watching as the slaps finally ceased. Chakotay looked up at her in sheer terror, unable to believe what had just happened. Fear gripped Chakotay as she stared at Nedi, the girl she had once treated as a mere servant. She pulled Ego close, and together they retreated to their room, shaken to the core. "Is she possessed?" Ego whispered, her voice trembling. "Could she be a witch?" Chakotay, still recovering from the shock, struggled to find an answer. They sat in terrified silence, their minds racing. "We can't stay in this house with her," Ego finally said. That night, as Ego lay in Nedi's old room, an overwhelming presence pinned her down. Terror flooded her as she gasped for breath. Panicked, she bolted upright and ran straight to her mother's room, clutching her throat. "Mama, I couldn't move. I felt something holding me down," she cried. Chakotay listened intently, her face pale. Ego's fear mirrored her own. "It has to be Nedi," Ego insisted. "She's doing this to us. We need to get rid of her before she destroys us." The next morning, Nedi woke up and went about her usual chores. As she cleaned, an unbearable heat spread through Chakotay and Ego's bodies. They clutched their arms, screaming as the burning intensified. It felt as if flames licked their skin from within. They rushed to the bathroom, splashing water over themselves, but the heat only grew worse. Nothing worked. The pain persisted until, at last, Nedi placed her broom down, signaling the completion of her cleaning. The moment she stopped, so did the burning. Chakotay and Ego sat frozen, panting as they watched Nedi quietly walk into the kitchen to prepare lunch. The instant she touched the food items, the fiery sensation returned. "Stop!" Chakotay shrieked. "Don't cook for us! Don't clean for us! Just go to your room before you kill us all!" Nedi stared at her aunt, unable to believe what she had just heard. The same woman who had tormented her for years was now pleading for her to abandon her chores. She hesitated, then turned and walked to her room, her real room, which had been taken from her since her father left. For the first time in years, she lay on her bed, her body heavy with exhaustion. Yet, there was no fear of being yanked from sleep and beaten. For the first time, she didn't feel helpless. Meanwhile, Chakotay and Ego sat in utter terror. They dared not approach Nedi's room or send her on any more errands. Every wicked act they had committed against her had backfired, filling them with dread. "Mama, what do we do now?" Ego asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chakotay took a deep breath, her expression darkening. "I have a plan." That night, when the house had fallen silent, Chakotay snuck into Nedi's room, carefully taking one of her dresses. Holding it close, she slipped out of the house under the cover of darkness. She made her way to the shrine of Ikuku, a powerful juju man known for his dark magic. If anyone could rid them of Nedi, it was him. Upon arriving, she found Ikuku already. "Waiting. You seek my help," he rasped, his piercing gaze locked onto her. Chakotay dropped to her knees, placing the dress before him. "Great One, my niece is possessed. She torments us daily. Please, I need you to destroy her before she destroys us." Ikuku picked up the dress, running his fingers over it as he muttered incantations. Suddenly, his body stiffened. His eyes rolled back, turning completely white. A powerful gust of wind rushed through the shrine, sending ashes swirling into the air. The flames before him roared and shifted from orange to a deep, unnatural blue. Chakotay stumbled backward, fear gripping her heart. Ikuku suddenly dropped the dress, his hands shaking as he spoke with fury. "You fool! Your niece is protected by a force far greater than mine." Chakotay's breath caught. That can't be. She's just a poor girl." Ikuku's glare deepened. "A girl? No, she is watched over by the spirit of her mother. A mother whose soul you have wronged. A mother whose anger burns beyond the grave. The moment you sought to harm her, you sealed your own fate." The flames in the shrine roared violently as Bui's spirit materialized before Chakotay. Her fiery gaze bore into her, and when she spoke, her voice thundered through the shrine. "You thought you could harm my daughter and escape after everything you did to her?" Chakotay let out a blood-curdling scream, dropping to the ground as she pleaded for mercy, but her pleas were met with an unseen force. Slap! invisible hand struck her face with crushing force. Then another, and another. She shrieked in agony as her skin began to rot before her very eyes. The flesh on her face darkened, peeling away in decay. Ikuku sat still, shaking his head. "You should not have come here," he murmured. Chakotay writhed in pain, her wails echoing through the shrine. The spirit of Bui spoke one final time. "You will live with the suffering you inflicted upon my daughter." Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fire in the shrine vanished. Chakotay clutched her face, horror washing over her as she realized what had happened. The spirit was gone, but it had left her with a wound that would never heal. She stumbled out of the shrine, racing back home, her face covered in filth and agony. Bursting into her daughter's room, she gasped for breath. Ego stirred awake, grimacing. "What is that terrible smell?" she said aloud as her eyes met her mother's, who stood just a few inches away, weeping. "Mama, what happened to you?" Ego asked, her voice filled with fear. Chakotay collapsed onto the floor, weak and trembling. "The spirits, they cursed me," she sobbed. Ego gasped, stepping back as the stench filled the entire room. She instinctively covered her nose. "Mother, you stink so bad," she said, trying not to gag. The decay had spread, leaving deep, festering wounds across Chakotay's cheeks. The suffocating odor made it unbearable. Chakotay sobbed uncontrollably, her hands trembling as she reached out to her daughter. "Don't touch me, Mother! You'll infect me!" Ego cried, backing away in horror. A heart-wrenching scream escaped Chakotay's lips. Once the proud Madame of the house, the woman who had controlled everything and everyone, she was now nothing more than a rotting, forsaken shell with no one to turn to. Hearing the commotion, Nedi emerged from her room. She froze in shock at the sight of Chakotay collapsed on the floor, her body shaking, her face covered in sores. For a long moment, no one spoke. Ego, clearly disgusted, turned away from her mother. Chakotay looked up at Nedi, her eyes pleading for mercy. Nedi took a deep breath. This was the woman who had tormented her, stolen her childhood, stripped her of dignity, and trampled on her for years. And yet as she looked upon her aunt's suffering, she felt pity. Without hesitation, Nedi stepped forward, knelt beside her aunt, and gently touched her hands. Chakotay's breath hitched. She could not believe it. The same girl she had despised and mistreated was now showing her kindness. "Auntie, we need to clean your wounds. If we don't, the infection will spread," Nedi said softly. Tears spilled down Chakotay's face. No one had ever spoken to her with such tenderness before. It was the kind of love she had denied Nedi, the kind of love she had mocked, and now, in her lowest moment, it was being freely given to her. Ego watched, her mouth opening and closing in disbelief. For years, they had beaten and belittled Nedi, and now, when she had every reason to turn her back on them, she was the one saving them. Overcome with guilt, Ego fell to her knees. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Nedi, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. Please forgive us." Nedi looked at her cousin, her heart calm. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said, smiling. Ego sobbed openly, unable to comprehend the grace of the girl they had once tormented. I'm sorry for everything. Please forgive us." Ego pleaded, her voice breaking with emotion. Without hesitation, Nedi nodded. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said with a warm smile. Ego sobbed openly, unable to believe the grace of the girl they had once tormented. From that day forward, everything changed. Chakotay and Ego, overwhelmed with guilt and gratitude, began to treat Nedi with love and kindness for the first time in years. Nedi was no longer a slave in her own home. Ego, once arrogant and spoiled, now walked beside Nedi. She helped in the kitchen, cleaned the house, and, most importantly, stood by Nedi's side as a true sister. Chakotay, deeply humbled by Nedi's kindness, devoted herself to making amends. At night, she would sit beside Nedi, speaking softly, sharing memories of her mother. Memories she had once buried beneath layers of jealousy and hatred. The wounds on Chakotay's face, once a rotten curse, began to heal. The more she treated Nedi with love, the clearer her skin became. The spirits had not cursed her with eternal suffering, they had given her a chance at redemption, and she embraced it wholeheartedly. Months passed, and the mansion, once filled with misery and cruelty, became a home of warmth and laughter. Ego and Nedi shared a sisterly bond stronger than ever before. They cooked together, told stories, and even braided each other's hair. Chakotay, once consumed by bitterness, became a different woman. She no longer saw Nedi as an enemy, but as a daughter. For the first time, they were at peace. Then, one fateful evening, a knock echoed through the house. Nedi stopped what she was doing, her heart racing. She rushed to the door and swung it open. Standing before her was Chief 04. "Papa!" Nedi screamed, throwing herself into his arms as tears streamed down. Her face. "My child," Chief 04 whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I have missed you so much." He held her tightly, his heart heavy with regret. Through his tears, Chief 04 recounted his tragic journey. He had unknowingly entered business with criminals who tricked him into taking possession of stolen goods. On his way back, he was arrested. Without any means of communication, he remained trapped for years, lost to the world. Only after the real culprits were caught was he finally released. As Nedi listened, tears poured down her face. She had always believed in her father, despite the rumors and the long, painful silence. Now, standing before him, she felt both relief and heartbreak for the years of suffering they had endured apart. But most of all, she was grateful to have her father back, grateful to live the rest of her life in peace with her aunt and cousin in a home now filled with love. The mansion, once a place of sorrow, had transformed into a sanctuary of unity. Nedi was no longer the forgotten girl. She was the heart of her family, the one who had turned hate into love, pain into healing, and enemies into family. And for the first time in her life, she was truly happy.